A man was standing inside my kitchen. I could see his shadow moving across the floor through the narrow crack between the pantry door and its frame. My heart hammered so hard I thought he might hear it. The house was completely dark except for the glow from the television upstairs. A recorded male voice drifted through the ceiling vents. Then another voice answered. The intruder froze. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then a dog barked somewhere outside. The man turned toward the staircase. I held my breath. Please leave. Please leave. A floorboard creaked. Then another. A moment later, I heard the back door open. And close. He was gone. I remained hidden inside the pantry for nearly 10 minutes before I dared move. My knees were shaking so badly I had to use the wall to stand. The phone was still pressed against my ear. The 911 dispatcher kept speaking softly. Ma'am, are you still there? Yes. My voice sounded strange, small, fragile. The dispatcher continued. Officers are arriving now. I closed my eyes. The tears finally came. Not because I was hurt. Because I suddenly understood something terrifying. If that man had believed I was alone, I might not be alive. And the reason he left was because of a lie. A lie I had told my son only a few hours earlier. For years, every Sunday, Daniel called with the same question. Every single Sunday. Without fail. Mom, are you alone? For years, I had always answered honestly. Until that night. Until the one Sunday I didn't. That lie saved my life. But to explain how it happened, I need to go back. Back to before the police. Before the intruder. Before the panic. Back to a simple question that I never fully understood. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 69 years old. I live in a small town outside Salem, Oregon. I've been a widow for 8 years. Sometimes when people hear that, they immediately picture loneliness. The truth is more complicated. Loneliness and solitude aren't the same thing. I missed my husband every day. Still do. But I wasn't lonely. Not most of the time. After 42 years of marriage, silence becomes familiar. Not painful. Just different. My husband Robert passed away unexpectedly from a heart attack when he was 67. One moment we were discussing what color to paint the guest room. The next moment my world had changed forever. People often ask whether grief becomes easier. I don't think that's the right word. It becomes familiar. Like an old scar. You stop touching it every day, but it's still there. I stayed in our house after Robert died. The same white farmhouse we'd owned for almost 30 years. The same kitchen. The same porch. The same garden. The memories helped, at least most of the time. My son Daniel worried about me living alone. I understood why. He's a good man. Always has been. Responsible. Reliable. Protective. Maybe a little too protective sometimes. Daniel lived about 3 hours away in Bend with his wife and 2 teenage daughters. Between work and family, he stayed busy. But he never forgot to call. Especially on Sundays. The calls always came around the same time. Usually late afternoon. Sometimes 3 o'clock. Sometimes 4. Never exactly scheduled. Yet somehow always expected. I'd often be finishing laundry. Watering flowers. Preparing dinner. The phone would ring. And there he'd be. Hi, Mom. Hi, sweetheart. We'd exchange a few words. Talk about weather. Talk about the girls. Talk about work. Then eventually it came. The question. The exact same question. Every week. Without fail. Mom, are you alone? The first few times I barely noticed. It sounded like concern. Perfectly reasonable concern. I was an older widow living by herself. Of course he'd ask. But after months became years, I started paying attention. Because the question never changed. Not once. Not ever. Sometimes he asked it at the beginning of the conversation. Sometimes at the end. Sometimes in the middle. But he always asked. And he always sounded serious when he did. Almost anxious. As though the answer mattered more than anything else we'd discussed. At first I found it sweet. Then curious. Then puzzling. Eventually a little unsettling. One Sunday I decided to tease him. No. There was immediate silence. I laughed. I'm kidding. The relief in his voice surprised me. Mom. What? Don't do that. I smiled. You're acting like I'm being monitored by the government. He didn't laugh. Just answer honestly. That response stayed with me longer than I expected. Just answer honestly. Why did it matter so much? I nearly asked, but something stopped me. Instead, I changed the subject. Looking back, maybe I should have pressed harder. Maybe I should have demanded an explanation. But parents don't always question their children when they should. Especially when those children have become adults themselves. You start assuming they have reasons. Even when they don't share them. A few weeks later, I mentioned it to my friend Nancy. We met every Wednesday at a small diner downtown. Coffee, pie, conversation, the sacred traditions of retirement. After hearing my story, Nancy laughed. Sounds like he's checking whether the house is empty. I laughed too, but something about the joke lingered. Not because I believed it, because it was the first alternative explanation I'd ever heard. Before then, I'd always assumed Daniel was worried about me. Now another possibility existed. A ridiculous possibility, but a possibility. What if he wasn't checking on me? What if he was checking on something else? The thought felt absurd. Daniel would never do anything dishonest. Never. Still, once an idea enters your mind, it can be difficult to remove. That evening, I found myself replaying years of conversations, years of identical questions, years of identical answers. And for the first time, I wondered, why was my son so interested in whether I was alone? At the time, I had no idea how important that question would become, or how close danger already was. For the next several weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about that question. Not obsessively, just enough to notice things I had ignored before. Human beings are funny that way. Once something catches your attention, it suddenly seems to appear everywhere. Every Sunday, every phone call, every pause, every careful tone in Daniel's voice. The question was always there. Mom, are you alone? And the strange thing was that he rarely seemed satisfied after hearing the answer. He sounded relieved, but never completely, as though he were listening for something beyond my words, something I couldn't hear. Life in our little corner of Oregon remained predictable. I liked it that way. Predictability becomes underrated as you get older. When you're young, excitement feels important. When you're older, reliability feels luxurious. Most mornings began the same way. Coffee, the local newspaper, a walk through the garden Robert and I planted years earlier. Tomatoes, peppers, a few stubborn roses that somehow survived every winter. Neighbors waved. Dogs barked. The mail arrived around noon. Nothing remarkable. Nothing dramatic. Just life. The kind of life many people spend decades trying to build. Which is why I noticed immediately when small things started feeling different. Not dangerous. Just odd. The kind of oddness that's easy to dismiss individually, yet harder to ignore when it keeps happening. The first thing was a dark SUV. I noticed it while watering flowers one afternoon. The vehicle moved slowly past my house. Not unusual. People drove down our road all the time. What caught my attention was the speed. The driver seemed to be studying addresses, looking, observing. Then the SUV disappeared around the corner. I forgot about it. Or at least I tried to. 2 days later, I saw it again. Same vehicle. Same slow pace. This time it stopped briefly near the mailbox before continuing. I couldn't see the driver. The windows were tinted. A few minutes later it was gone. Maybe coincidence. Probably coincidence. Still, I found myself watching from the porch longer than usual. Oh, the second thing happened the following week. My phone rang shortly after dinner. I answered. Nobody spoke. Not a word. At first I assumed it was a wrong number. Then I heard breathing. Faint. Almost imperceptible. The line remained open for several seconds, then disconnected. I stared at the phone. People receive strange calls all the time. Telemarketers. Scammers. Wrong numbers. I knew that. But something about the silence bothered me. Maybe because it felt deliberate. Like someone verifying that I would answer. The next day it happened again. This time I hung up first. A few days later, a repairman knocked on my front door. At least he looked like a repairman. Uniform, clipboard, tool bag. The whole package. When I answered, he smiled politely. Mrs. Carter. Yes? I'm here to inspect the water heater. I frowned. My water heater. He nodded. Your son requested a service visit. That immediately felt wrong. Daniel had never arranged repairs for my house. Never. Not because he didn't care. Because he knew I handled those things myself. Which company are you with? The man hesitated. Only for a second. But I noticed. Then he named a company I'd never heard of. Something tightened inside me. I don't think so. The smile faded. He checked his clipboard, looked at the address, then suddenly apologized. Must have the wrong house. A minute later, he was gone. I watched his truck leave, then immediately called Daniel. Did you send someone to inspect my water heater? The silence on the other end lasted long enough to worry me. No. I felt my stomach drop. No. He sounded genuinely confused. What happened? After I explained, his voice changed. Not dramatically, just enough. Did you get the company name? I told him. Another pause. Mom. What? If anyone comes again, call me. The seriousness in his voice made me uncomfortable. You're overreacting. No. The answer came too quickly, too firmly. No, I'm not. That conversation stayed with me. More importantly, Daniel seemed distracted afterward, concerned. Several times he started to say something, then stopped. I noticed. Parents always notice. Finally, I asked, "Is there something you're not telling me?" A long pause followed. Then, no. It wasn't a convincing no, but I let it go, at least temporarily. The following Wednesday, Nancy and I met for pie. Halfway through lunch, I told her everything. The strange calls. The repairman. The SUV. Nancy listened carefully. Unlike many people, she never dismissed concerns immediately. When I'd finished, she stirred her coffee quietly, then said, "Maybe you should be careful." I laughed. "You sound like Daniel. Maybe Daniel has a point." That surprised me. Nancy wasn't usually dramatic. Neither was I, which made her concern feel significant. For the first time, I started locking the doors earlier in the evening, checking windows before bed, leaving exterior lights on overnight. Simple things, nothing excessive, just precautions. Still, part of me felt silly. I was a retired widow in a peaceful Oregon town, not the star of a crime documentary. Then came the county records incident. That was the moment everything stopped feeling random. A former colleague worked at the county clerk's office. One afternoon she called. At first we chatted normally. Then she asked an unexpected question. "Everything okay with your property?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" "Nothing." The hesitation told me otherwise. After a moment she continued, "I noticed someone recently requesting information connected to your address." The room suddenly felt colder. "What kind of information?" "Ownership records, property history, tax information." I sat down. "Who requested it?" "I'm not supposed to say." Of course she wasn't. I understood that. Still, the information unsettled me. A lot. Because now there was a pattern. The SUV. The calls. The fake repairman. The record search. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they felt different. Much different. That Sunday, Daniel called again. We talked about weather, about his daughters, about a camping trip he'd taken. Then finally it came. The familiar question. The question I now dreaded hearing. "Mom." A pause. Then, "Are you alone?" This time, instead of answering immediately, I asked one of my own. "Daniel." Another pause. "What aren't you telling me?" The line went quiet. For a moment, I thought Daniel might pretend he hadn't heard me. He'd done that before when conversations became uncomfortable. Not often. Just enough for a mother to recognize the pattern. "Daniel," I repeated. "What aren't you telling me?" I heard him exhale. The sound carried a kind of exhaustion I hadn't noticed before. Then he said something unexpected. "Mom, have you noticed anything strange lately?" My grip tightened around the phone. That wasn't an answer. But it wasn't a denial either. "Why are you asking?" Another pause. Then, "Just answer me." The seriousness in his voice immediately raised my pulse. I glanced toward the darkening backyard. The porch light illuminated the garden Robert and I had built years earlier. Everything looked normal, peaceful, safe, and yet suddenly I wasn't sure. I've had some strange calls. Silence. Then, what else? The speed of his response startled me. Not because of what he said, because it sounded like he'd been expecting it. So I told him. The SUV, the fake repairman, the property record search, everything. Daniel remained silent throughout. When I finally finished, he spoke softly. "Damn." The word landed heavily. My son almost never cursed. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I heard movement on his end. A door closing. Footsteps. The sound of someone seeking privacy. That alone told me this conversation was different from every Sunday call before it. When Daniel returned, his voice sounded lower, more careful. "Mom, I didn't want to tell you this." I sat down at the kitchen table. The same table where Robert and I had spent thousands of evenings. The same table where I'd paid bills, written Christmas cards, helped grandchildren with homework. Suddenly it felt like a witness to something important. "Tell me what—" Another pause. Then, 2 months ago, an elderly widow was attacked near Bend. The room felt smaller. Attacked? Daniel hesitated. Her house was targeted. I listened quietly. The police believe someone had been watching her. A cold sensation moved through my chest. The details sounded disturbingly familiar. Watching? Tracking routines. I closed my eyes. The SUV immediately came to mind. The silent phone calls. The fake repairman, Daniel continued. They learned when she was alone. My stomach tightened. Then came the sentence that changed everything. That's why I keep asking. For a moment I didn't understand. Then I did. The Sunday question. Every week. Every single week. Mom, are you alone? Suddenly it made sense. Or at least part of it did. You thought someone might be watching me? The words felt absurd. Yet Daniel didn't laugh. No. That answer surprised me. Then he added, I was afraid someone eventually would. The distinction mattered. And somehow made the situation feel even more serious. Daniel explained that after the attack near Bend, local law enforcement had shared information with community groups. The criminals weren't choosing victims randomly. They studied people first, observed routines, collected information, looked for opportunities, particularly elderly homeowners living alone, widows, retirees, people perceived as vulnerable. The description made my skin crawl, not because I felt vulnerable, because I fit every category. For years I'd viewed myself as independent, capable, self-sufficient. Those things were still true, but independence and invulnerability aren't the same thing. Daniel seemed to understand that better than I did. Why didn't you tell me? His answer came immediately. Because I knew you'd worry. I almost laughed. You realize I'm worrying now? Exactly. He sounded frustrated, then softer. I didn't know how to talk about it. That part I understood. Parents and adult children often struggle with role reversals. Eventually, someone starts worrying about someone who used to worry about them. Nobody teaches you how to handle that transition. You simply stumble through it together. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, much longer than our usual Sunday calls. By the end, I understood several things. Daniel wasn't hiding a secret because he distrusted me. He was hiding it because he was scared. And fear often makes people communicate badly, particularly when family is involved. But there was still one thing he hadn't explained. The pharmacy, the property records, the growing patterns surrounding my house. Finally, I asked, do you think those things are connected? The silence that followed worried me, because silence sometimes says more than words. Eventually, Daniel answered, I don't know. I believed him. That uncertainty felt genuine. Then he added, but I don't like it. Neither did I. After hanging up, I walked through the house. Not because I expected to find anything, because I suddenly needed reassurance. The back door was locked. The windows were secure. The alarm system worked. Everything looked normal. Yet normal no longer felt comforting. Because danger rarely announces itself. It usually hides inside ordinary moments. That realization stayed with me all week. 3 days later, Daniel called unexpectedly. Wednesday, not Sunday. Immediately, I knew something was wrong. My son wasn't a casual caller. If he called midweek, there was a reason. Mom, his voice sounded tense. What happened? For a moment, he seemed surprised I'd guessed. Then he sighed. I talked to a detective today. That got my attention. A detective. Not a neighbor. Not a friend. A detective. Apparently, investigators were examining several suspicious incidents connected to elderly homeowners throughout the region. Most involved scams. Some involved burglaries. A few involved far worse. The common pattern remained the same. Information gathering. Observation. Patience. The criminals preferred preparation over force. That detail unsettled me more than anything, because it explained the phone calls, the fake repairman, the questions. Someone wasn't acting impulsively. Someone was collecting information. That evening I sat on the porch long after sunset. The neighborhood remained quiet. Children rode bicycles. Dogs barked. A sprinkler clicked rhythmically across a lawn. Everything looked safe, ordinary, exactly as it always had. Yet I found myself studying every passing vehicle, every unfamiliar face, every unusual sound. Not because I was paranoid, because awareness had replaced certainty. There's a difference. One creates fear, the other creates caution. And caution has saved many lives. I didn't know it yet, but mine would soon be one of them. Because 2 days later I would notice something parked down the street. Something that would make me tell the first lie I'd ever told Daniel. And that lie would change everything. By Friday afternoon, I had convinced myself Daniel was overreacting. Not completely. Just enough to breathe easier. The human mind has a remarkable ability to normalize anxiety when enough time passes without anything happening. The phone calls had stopped. No strangers had appeared. No mysterious repairman knocked on my door. Life looked ordinary again. And I wanted very badly to believe ordinary was exactly what it seemed. That morning I visited the grocery store, stopped by the pharmacy, picked up fertilizer for the garden, the sort of errands retirees spend entire mornings accomplishing. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. By lunchtime I felt almost embarrassed by how worried I'd been. Then I noticed the SUV, again. It sat halfway down the street, dark gray, tinted windows, engine running, the same vehicle I'd seen twice before. This time there was no doubt. I recognized it immediately. I slowed my car without meaning to. The SUV remained parked, not moving, not leaving, just waiting. For a moment I considered driving closer. Then common sense intervened. Instead I continued home, trying very hard to act normal, trying even harder not to look in the rearview mirror every 5 seconds. By the time I reached my driveway, the vehicle was gone, vanished, as though it had never existed. But now I knew something important. I wasn't imagining things. That evening I called Nancy. She listened quietly while I described the SUV, again. When I finished, she asked, "Have you told Daniel?" "No." "Why not?" Because I was tired of worrying him. Because I was tired of worrying myself. Because saying things out loud sometimes makes them feel more real. Pick any of those reasons. All of them were true. Nancy sighed. "You should tell him." "I probably will." But I didn't. At least not immediately. The next morning I woke before sunrise. One of the strange things about aging is that sleep becomes less predictable. Sometimes you sleep wonderfully. Sometimes your body decides 4:30 in the morning is an appropriate time to begin the day. This happened to be one of those mornings. I made coffee, wrapped myself in Robert's old flannel robe, and sat on the porch watching the sky brighten. The world felt peaceful. Birds moved through the trees. The air smelled faintly of wet earth. For a little while all my worries seemed ridiculous. Then I noticed tire tracks near the edge of my property. Fresh ones. My first instinct was to dismiss them. People occasionally turned around near the road. That wasn't unusual. Yet something about their location bothered me. The tracks weren't near the entrance. They were closer to the side yard, near the area hidden from the road. I stared at them longer than necessary, then forced myself to go inside. Because there is a fine line between caution and obsession, and I wasn't willing to cross it. Not yet. Sunday arrived. Gray clouds hung low across the valley. Rain threatened but never quite appeared. I spent most of the afternoon cleaning closets, one of those retirement projects that somehow takes 6 hours and accomplishes very little. By 3 o'clock I'd filled 2 donation boxes and rediscovered 3 sweaters I'd forgotten existed. At 3:30 the phone rang. Daniel, right on schedule. For years the Sunday calls had been comforting. Now they carried tension. I hated that. I hated feeling suspicious. I hated feeling afraid. Most of all, I hated knowing my son was carrying the same fear. "Hi, Mom." "Hi, sweetheart." His voice sounded tired. More tired than usual. We talked about ordinary things. The girls. Work. The weather. The conversation felt normal. Almost reassuring. Then I glanced out the front window, and my stomach dropped. The SUV was back. Parked farther away this time. Partially hidden behind trees. But unmistakable. The same vehicle. The same dark windows. The same feeling. A cold sensation moved through me. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Daniel was still talking. I barely heard him. My attention remained fixed on the SUV. The engine appeared to be running. Yet nobody exited. Nobody approached. Nobody left. The vehicle simply waited. Watching. At least that's what it felt like. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. But instinct doesn't always require evidence. Sometimes it simply recognizes patterns before your conscious mind catches up. Daniel paused. "Mom." "Yes." "You okay?" I looked at the SUV again, then at the empty house around me, then at Robert's old photograph sitting beside the lamp. For some reason I suddenly remembered something he'd once told me. If something feels wrong, don't ignore it just because you can't explain it. Trust yourself. The memory arrived so clearly it almost felt like hearing his voice. Then Daniel asked the question. The same question he'd asked every Sunday for years. "Mom." A pause. "Are you alone?" Normally I answered without thinking. Yes. Always yes. Because it was always true. Today was different. I stared at the SUV. Something inside me tightened. Every instinct I possessed seemed to be screaming. Not fear. Warning. The distinction mattered. Fear paralyzes. Warning prepares. Without fully understanding why, I heard myself answer. No. The word surprised me. Because it wasn't true. I was completely alone. The house was empty. No guests, no family, no neighbors. Just me. Yet I said it anyway. No. Silence filled the line. Then Daniel exhaled. The tension immediately disappeared from his voice. Good. Just one word. Good. As though he'd been hoping for that answer. As though he'd been waiting years to hear it. We finished the conversation normally. Neither of us mentioned the lie. But after hanging up, I stood beside the window watching the SUV. A few minutes later, it drove away. Slowly. Quietly. Almost reluctantly. And for the first time all week, I felt certain. Someone had been watching. The only question now was why. Unfortunately, I was about to learn the answer. That night, after Daniel and I hung up, I remained standing by the front window. The SUV was still there. Motionless. Silent. Watching. At least that's how it felt. The late afternoon sky had turned darker. Rain clouds pressed low across the valley. The street looked almost deserted. A few houses showed signs of life. A garage door opening. A child riding a bicycle. A dog pulling its owner down the sidewalk. Normal things. Comforting things. Yet the SUV sat among them like a wrong note in a familiar song. I couldn't prove it. But I felt it. And at 69 years old, I'd learned something important. Instinct deserves respect. Not blind obedience, not panic. Respect. For nearly 30 minutes, I watched from different windows. The vehicle never moved. No doors opened. Nobody got out. Nobody approached the house. Then, just as suddenly as before, it pulled away. Gone. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt uneasy. Because now I knew my instincts had been right. The SUV hadn't appeared by accident. And my lie had mattered. I didn't know why. But it had. As evening approached, I started doing something I hadn't done in years. Preparing. Not for company. For uncertainty. The idea arrived gradually. Then all at once. If someone believed I wasn't alone, what would that sound like? The question seemed ridiculous. Until I realized I already knew the answer. Families are noisy. Even quiet families make noise. Televisions. Footsteps. Conversations. Dogs. Doors opening. The sounds of ordinary life. I walked upstairs and found an old video. A recording from Thanksgiving several years earlier. The whole family had been there. Daniel. His wife. The girls. Robert. Laughter. Conversations. The chaotic soundtrack of people who love one another. I hadn't watched it since Robert died. For a moment, grief nearly stopped me. Then I pressed play. Voices filled the upstairs living room. Warm. Familiar. Alive. I stood at the bottom of the stairs listening. The effect was surprisingly convincing. Anyone outside would assume multiple people were inside. Maybe many people. The idea expanded from there. I turned on the television in the guest room. Left a lamp glowing upstairs. Placed another light in the kitchen. Nothing obvious. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to suggest activity. Company. Presence. Then I remembered Nancy's dog. Charlie. A golden retriever with a bark large enough to belong to an animal twice his size. I smiled despite myself. Nancy was spending the evening with her daughter. But Charlie was staying overnight with me. A favor we'd arranged weeks earlier. For the first time, I felt grateful for the timing. Charlie wandered through the house happily, completely unaware that he had become part of my security plan. Around 9 o'clock, I called Nancy. "How's Charlie behaving?" She laughed. "Already spoiled." "Probably." Then my tone changed. Immediately, she noticed. What happened? I told her about the SUV, the lie, the strange feeling I couldn't shake. By the time I'd finished speaking, Nancy sounded worried. "Evelyn, maybe you should stay with me tonight." The offer touched me, but I declined. "I'll be fine." "You don't know that." "No." I looked around the house. "But I know running won't make me feel safer." Nancy sighed. "Call me if anything feels wrong." "I will." At the time, neither of us realized how important that promise would become. By 10:30, the house had settled into silence, or at least as much silence as possible. The upstairs television murmured softly. Occasional laughter drifted from the Thanksgiving recording. Charlie slept beside the couch. Rain tapped gently against the windows. Everything seemed calm, yet I couldn't relax. Several times I checked the locks, the alarm system, the porch lights, the windows. Each inspection told me the same thing. Everything was secure. Still, something felt wrong. Deeply wrong. The sensation wasn't dramatic, just persistent, like hearing distant thunder before a storm arrives. At 11:15, Charlie suddenly lifted his head. The change was immediate. 1 second asleep, the next completely alert. I sat upright. The dog stared toward the back of the house, listening. A low growl emerged from his chest. My pulse quickened. "Charlie," the growl continued, then stopped. The house became quiet again. Several seconds passed. Nothing. I almost convinced myself it was nothing. Then Charlie stood. Every hair along his back rose. And he barked, loudly, once, twice, 3 times. The sound exploded through the house. At the exact same moment, I heard something outside. A noise near the back door. Not loud, not obvious, but unmistakable. Metal touching metal. A handle moving. Someone testing the door. My blood turned cold. Every instinct suddenly became certainty. Someone was there. Someone had come to my house. And they weren't knocking. Without thinking, I grabbed my phone. Years of calm disappeared instantly. Training. Logic. Preparation. Everything narrowed into a single objective. Stay alive. I dialed 911. The operator answered immediately. 911, what's your emergency? I lowered my voice. I think someone's trying to get into my house. The words sounded unreal, as though they belonged to someone else's life, not mine. The operator's tone became calm and focused. Are you safe? I don't know. The answer was honest, terrifying, and true. Then another sound came from the back of the house. A click, a soft thud. And suddenly I realized something horrifying. The person outside was no longer outside. The person outside was no longer outside. That realization hit me harder than fear. Fear comes first. Then reality arrives. And reality is usually worse. I stood frozen in the living room, phone pressed against my ear. Charlie barked again, louder this time. The sound echoed through the house. The 911 dispatcher remained calm. Ma'am, stay on the line. I swallowed hard. Someone's inside. Can you safely move away from them? My eyes darted toward the hallway. The back of the house sat in darkness. Nothing moved. Nothing visible. Yet every instinct screamed the same warning. Run! Hide! Now. I grabbed Charlie's collar and moved toward the pantry beside the kitchen. It wasn't ideal. But it locked from the inside. At that moment, ideal wasn't available. Only possible. I slipped inside, closed the door, locked it, then crouched behind shelves filled with canned vegetables and holiday decorations. Charlie remained silent beside me. Good dog. Very good dog. The dispatcher continued speaking softly, reassuringly, the way people do when they're trying to keep panic from spreading. Officers are on the way. How long? Very close. Close felt too far away. Then I heard footsteps. Slow. Careful. Inside my house. A sound that instantly transformed everything familiar into something threatening. The floor creaked near the kitchen. Then again, the person wasn't rushing. That terrified me more. Rushed people make mistakes. Careful people have plans. The footsteps paused, then resumed. I closed my eyes, trying to listen, trying to understand. The intruder seemed to be moving through the first floor, methodically, patiently, searching. My house suddenly felt impossibly small. Every room, every hallway, every memory-filled corner, now occupied by a stranger. Charlie growled softly. I placed a hand on his neck. The dog's muscles felt tense. Ready. Protective. For a moment I thought about Robert. About all the evenings we'd spent inside this house. The holidays. The birthdays. The ordinary Tuesday nights. And suddenly anger appeared. Not panic. Anger. Someone had invaded the place where my life happened. The place where my husband lived. The place where his photographs still sat on shelves. The place where his voice still existed inside my memories. That anger helped. It steadied me. Fear narrows your thinking. Anger sometimes sharpens it. A floorboard creaked upstairs. I frowned, then remembered. The recording. The Thanksgiving video. Family voices drifted from the second floor. Laughter. Conversation. The ordinary sounds of people spending time together. The noises floated through the vents. Natural. Believable. Real. The intruder heard them too, because the footsteps stopped immediately. Completely. For several seconds the house became silent. I imagined him listening, trying to count voices, trying to understand who was inside, trying to determine whether he had made a mistake. The dispatcher whispered, "What's happening?" I answered just as quietly, "I think he hears something." Then another sound joined the recording, a bark. Charlie wasn't responsible this time. The sound came from outside, a neighbor's dog. The timing felt miraculous. One bark, then another. The kind of sound people barely notice during normal life. But normal life wasn't happening. Not tonight. To the intruder, the barking likely confirmed what the voices suggested. People were home. Multiple people. Possibly with a dog. Risk. Witnesses. Complications. Exactly what criminals try to avoid. The footsteps resumed. Faster now. Less confident. The intruder moved toward the staircase, paused, listened again. The Thanksgiving recording continued upstairs. Daniel's voice drifted through the ceiling. Then one of my granddaughters laughing. The effect was uncanny. Even I almost believed they were there. Then came another unexpected gift. The television in the guest room changed volume automatically during a commercial break. The sudden increase in sound traveled through the hallway. The intruder reacted immediately. I heard movement. Quick movement. Not searching anymore. Retreating. A door opened, then slammed. Silence followed. Complete silence. For several moments I wasn't sure whether he had actually left, or simply stopped moving. The uncertainty felt unbearable. I remained inside the pantry, listening, waiting. The dispatcher kept talking, encouraging, patient, professional. Then finally another sound reached me. Sirens, distant at first, then closer, much closer. The most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. Several minutes later, officers entered the house. I heard voices, commands, movement. Then someone announced, "Police department." The dispatcher instructed me to remain hidden until an officer identified himself directly. A wise instruction. One I followed. Eventually, a voice came through the pantry door. "Mrs. Carter." I nearly cried. "We're here." The relief was overwhelming, the kind that leaves you weak afterward. I unlocked the door, stepped out, and immediately saw the expressions on the officers' faces. They believed me. That mattered. Because deep down I'd worried they might think I was an elderly woman imagining things. Instead, they looked serious, focused, concerned. One officer walked me through the house. The back door showed signs of forced entry. Not major damage, but enough. Enough to prove someone had entered. Enough to prove I hadn't imagined any of it. Enough to prove danger had been real. The senior officer asked several questions. Then he stopped near the staircase. "Can I ask something?" "Of course." What was going on upstairs? I frowned, then understood. The television. And the voices. For the first time all night I smiled. The voices were a recording. The officer blinked. "A recording?" I nodded. His expression changed immediately. Then he laughed softly. Not because it was funny, because he understood. That's probably why he left. The words settled over me. Heavy, sobering, profound. Because suddenly the entire evening made sense. The lie, the recording, the illusion, the voices, the dog, all of it. The intruder believed I wasn't alone. And because of that belief, he walked away. The officer looked directly at me. "If he'd known you were by yourself." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I already understood. Daniel arrived before sunrise. I was sitting at my kitchen table wrapped in the blue quilt Robert's mother had made us years ago. 2 police officers had already left. Another had taken photographs of the back door. Nancy was in the living room with Charlie speaking softly to him as though he had personally saved the neighborhood. In a way, maybe he had. My hands were still trembling around a mug of tea I hadn't touched. The house looked almost normal. That was the strangest part. After fear passes, ordinary objects look different. The same kitchen chair, the same curtains, the same clock on the wall. But now they belonged to the place where a stranger had walked through my home while I hid in a pantry praying not to be found. When headlights swept across the front windows, I knew it was Daniel. A moment later, he was at the door. He didn't knock. He used his key. Then he stepped into the hallway with his coat half-buttoned and his face pale from 3 hours of driving through the dark. "Mom," I stood. He crossed the room so quickly I barely had time to set down my mug. Then my son wrapped both arms around me. Tight. Almost painfully tight. I felt him shaking. Not from cold. From fear. For several seconds he didn't say anything. Neither did I. Sometimes words arrive too late for the moment. Sometimes all you can do is hold on. Finally he whispered, "I'm so sorry." I closed my eyes. "For what?" "For not being here." That broke something in me. Not in a bad way. In the way ice breaks when spring finally comes. I pulled back and looked at him. "You live 3 hours away." "I should have done more." "You did." He shook his head. "Not enough." I placed both hands on his face. He was 42 years old. A grown man. A husband. A father. But in that moment I saw the little boy who used to run inside with scraped knees and muddy shoes. "Daniel," I said softly, "your question saved my life." His eyes filled. For the first time all night mine did too. We sat together at the kitchen table while morning slowly brightened the windows. Nancy eventually went home with Charlie. She hugged me twice before leaving. "You're staying with me tonight," she said. "It wasn't a question." I smiled. "Yes, ma'am." That made Daniel laugh weakly. A small laugh. A needed one. After she left, the house grew quiet. Different from before. Not peaceful yet, but no longer terrifying. Daniel looked at the back door. The lock had been damaged. The frame scratched. A visible reminder that danger had crossed a line. He swallowed. "I kept asking if you were alone because I was scared. I know that now." I should have explained. "Yes." He looked down at his hands. "I didn't want to make you feel old." That surprised me, then saddened me. Because there it was. The invisible worry between aging parents and adult children. The fear of insulting someone while trying to protect them. "I am old," I said. He looked up quickly. "Mom," I raised a hand. "I am. That's not an insult. It's a fact. I've earned every year." His mouth twitched slightly. "But old doesn't mean helpless." "I know." "Do you—" He didn't answer immediately. That honesty meant something. Finally, he said, "I'm learning." So was I. Because I had misunderstood him too. For months, part of me had wondered whether Daniel was checking on the house, the property, the possibility of inheritance. That shame settled heavily inside me. I admitted it aloud. "I thought maybe you were asking for the wrong reason." He frowned. "What reason?" I looked toward the window. "I wondered if you were checking whether the house was empty." The hurt on his face appeared immediately, but it passed quickly. Or maybe he swallowed it. Because of what Nancy said, I nodded. And because I was scared. He took a long breath. "I guess fear made both of us poor communicators." That was one of the truest things either of us had said. Later that morning, a detective came by. He was polite. Middle-aged? Tired in the way people become tired after seeing too much of human behavior. He explained that the man who entered my home had likely been connected to a small group targeting older homeowners across several counties. They studied routines, collected information, used fake service visits, checked property records, called homes at odd hours. Everything I had noticed. Everything I had nearly dismissed. The detective didn't sugarcoat it. "You did the right thing by calling 911. Then he added, "And whatever made him think other people were in the house probably prevented a much worse situation." Daniel reached for my hand under the table. I let him take it. Boo. The arrest came 2 days later. A patrol officer recognized the SUV from a description I'd provided. Inside the vehicle, police found burglary tools, copied addresses, and notes about homeowners' routines. My name was on one of the pages. Seeing that nearly made my knees give out. Not because I needed proof. Because proof has weight. It turns fear into fact. For a while afterward, I stayed with Nancy. Then Daniel installed better locks, outdoor cameras, and motion lights. He didn't do it like a man taking over. He did it like a son finally learning how to help without making his mother feel small. That mattered. He also changed the Sunday calls. Not by stopping the question. By changing what came before it. Now he asked about my week, my garden, my friends, my blood pressure, my stubborn left knee. Then, eventually, he would still ask, "Mom, are you alone?" But now I heard it differently. I no longer heard suspicion. I heard love trying to sound practical. I heard fear trying to behave politely. I heard my son saying in the only way he knew how, "I need to know you're safe." Months have passed since that night. The back door has been repaired. The pantry no longer frightens me. Charlie still visits sometimes, and I always give him an extra treat. Nancy insists he deserves a medal. Maybe he does. Daniel still calls every Sunday. Sometimes his daughters join the call. Sometimes his wife does too. Sometimes I tell him I'm alone. Sometimes I tell him Nancy is over. Once, just to make him smile, I said, "No, Charlie is here guarding the kingdom." He laughed so hard I had to hold the phone away from my ear. That sound felt like healing. Not all at once. Healing rarely works that way. But little by little. Call by call. Truth by truth. What I learned is simple. Sometimes the people who ask the same question again and again aren't trying to control you. Sometimes they're trying to make sure they still have you. And sometimes the answer that saves your life is the one you never expected to give. If you live alone or love someone who does, please don't wait for fear to start the conversation. Check the locks, know your neighbors, trust your instincts, and take the phone call even when the question feels repetitive. Because love is often hidden inside ordinary habits. A weekly call, a familiar question, a voice on the other end asking whether you're safe. If this story reminded you of someone who checks on you or someone you need to check on, reach out today while you still can. And if stories about family dignity, courage, and second chances speak to your heart, I hope you'll share this one and come back for the next.